And by essentially allowing that dynamic management, which we increasingly believe is really part of the value add that we bring to our customers, is keeping their costs low, but also keeping their costs low by managing it on a essentially every 15-minute increment, is bringing that capability and that technology to the table to be able to find that balance between the ongoing monetary system, as you described, and blockchain, and the power markets, and making sure that we're optimizing the relationship between those two.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Crypto Weekly podcast, the show where we introduce and interview the top influencers, investors, and corporate executives in the crypto space. Today, I'm joined with the Chief Financial Officer of Compute North, Tad Piper. Thank you so much for joining the show.
Yeah, Mike, thanks for having me today. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, Tad, for the people that don't follow the space quite as closely as we do, why don't you maybe introduce yourself and a little bit about what Compute North does?
Yeah, so first and foremost, I'm, as Mike said, Tad Piper. I'm the CFO of Compute North. And what Compute North is we're what we refer to as we call it a tier 0 data center provider, which means we provide colocation services, hosting infrastructure services, to what we oftentimes refer to as non-mission critical compute applications, which means the early adopters in that space have very much been a lot of the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency providers, but we continue to look for other applications as well that will really work well within that environment. And happy to get more into kind of what non-mission critical means and things like that, but I'll let you lead us down that path if you'd like, Mike.
Well, why don't we actually start there? Because that's something I was meaning to ask. You know, you talk about tier 0, and I think it goes up to tier 4. And my understanding is that that refers to redundancy of inputs of production. Why don't you maybe give a little bit more depth onto what tier 0 refers to and why that can be so much more cost efficient for miners in the industry?
Yeah, so in the data center space, essentially the difference in the traditional sense between tier 1 and tier 4 is essentially the level of redundancy that is built in. So, do I have N? Do I have N plus 1 in a traditional sense? Do I have, so all the way up to tier 4, where I may have uninterrupted power supply, backup generators, primary feeds. I may have hot swappable server capability. In other words, my primary objective is to try to get to north of 5 nines of reliability. And for a number of applications, that is a very necessary aspect. I want that ongoing critical reliability because I'm either doing streaming or I've got applications that require synchronous communications, ongoing connectivity. Whereas obviously in the case of, so using as the other example, using an application like blockchain, which by definition is a distributed architecture where if one node in the network goes down, it just keeps operating because it relies on the rest of the nodes or the rest of the miners in the network to continue to operate. So in a sense, by definition, a distributed infrastructure like blockchain it does not rely on a single point of failure, which essentially means that by definition, it is essentially a non-mission critical compute function in a single server or location. And so the difference essentially is that in a traditional sense, in a traditional data center, the redundancy is built into the hardware, whereas in the applications that work best in our environments rely more on the value of the network and the distributed nature of the network to provide that overall reliability of the overall network. Now, the trade-off there is that by doing that, it means that we don't build as many levels of redundancy, which means that we can operate at far lower costs of both capital investment on the front end, but most importantly, operating expenses on behalf of our customers. And I'm sure we'll touch on it a little bit more, but that ability to essentially have non-mission critical and the ability to have interruptibility of power supply makes a tier 0 data center a really good complementary solution to the evolution of the power grid, which we can touch on further if you'd like to go there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the major innovations or breakthrough that Bitcoin has brought to the world, is this ability to find the lowest cost source of energy, right? We don't need it to be running 100% of the time every single time. The way I've heard tier 0 talked about is that it's a best effort type of model where you provide all the energy possible, but not necessarily 100% of the time to the 0000. So why don't we talk about this innovation of Bitcoin as a means to harness cheap renewable energy and what that might do, for the world as we continue to expand our energy consumption.
Yeah. So let's just focus for a minute on the power sector for a minute, and what's going on in the energy complex overall. In a very traditional sense, you have base load power, which has been coal, combined cycle gas, nuclear power plants. And what you've really had traditionally is an overall power grid, if you will, that's been centered on fewer centralized sources of power that are then distributed across the grid. They run 24/7 in most cases. They increase their generation or decreased in order to balance the grid. So that's kind of where we've been coming from, and that's what I would say, a decade plus ago is really what most of the grid power was. Now we've moved to the advent of renewables, which are going to include solar, wind, hydroelectric. Particularly in the case of solar and wind, by definition, those are intermittent sources of power. The wind's not blowing, the sun isn't shining, you're going to have more intermittency. That's one aspect. The other aspect is that by definition, you also have more distributed sources of power. In other words, a 1 gigawatt power plant sits at one location, 1 gigawatt of wind or solar is generally spread out over a far greater geography. What you need in order to continue to stabilize the grid is you need essentially ways to match intermittent demand with intermittent supply, or you need other sources of intermittent supply to match up with your renewable resources. So in a traditional sense, you've seen more what are called spinning reserves or peaker plants or things like that react when, shall I say, in a simple case, the sun goes behind a cloud or the wind isn't blowing. It's a little bit more sophisticated than that at the grid operations level. But at a very high level, that is the problem that the grid is dealing with on a regular basis. So, what has the grid done overall? In California, you've seen the advent of the deployment of lots of big battery banks, which allow for shorter term management of that. You've seen the advent of more increase in peaker plants and spinning reserves, which is a lot more CapEx as well. But the area that we think and are most excited about, obviously, because it's the business that we're in, is essentially matching intermittent supply with intermittent demand and bringing what are called demand response programs. So essentially what that means is that if the grid has stability issues, we have the ability to reduce our usage of power in those moments, which is exactly what we did in Texas in February, where we were called upon and critical services like hospitals and people's homes to heat and things like that take a higher priority. And we actually reduced our usage at the request of the grid operators in order to help stabilize the operations of the grid overall. And we think really that's the future of where tier 0 or non-mission critical compute can prove to be a very, very valuable partner to the advent and the build out of renewables, can actually stabilize the grid in times of need and do so in a far more capital efficient way than spending billions of dollars on batteries, which, to use an extreme example like February in Texas, where the grid needed that stability for 4 hours, I don't know, or for 4 days, I should say, plus, I don't know of any battery bank that's in place that could have solved that problem for 4 days without recharging sometime during that 4-day period. And so I'd say that, you know, with the advent, the grid needs lots of solutions. We don't claim to be, you know, one, we just claim to be one of those options in a far more sophisticated and more dynamic grid operations than we've seen historically.
Yeah, and I think this is such a massive step forward in energy production. I'm not sure it, you know, I'm not sure most can fully wrap their head around what this means for energy production, mostly because most people don't fully understand what the grid, how the grid even operates. They just turn on a light and, you know, electricity comes in.
Well, that's even, I mean, just to jump on that just for a second, like that's the key, right? Which is, you know, people want renewable power and they also want to throw the switch and have the lights come on.
Right.
And as I like to say, if you want renewable power without some of these other aspects, these complexities to manage the grid, then you get the equivalent of camping with a solar panel, right? When the sun's out in the middle of the day, you can run your cell phone.
Right.
At night, you're out of luck. And I think that's the trade-off. And I think that's where the, you know, as we like to say that, you know, this is not a black and white issue. It's just different shades of green. And we need to continue to evolve the grid. And so I think some of the arguments out there are a little bit too narrow in their understanding of the complexities.
Yeah. Well, speaking of evolving the grid, I want to ask you about, I was watching a podcast the other day with Lynn Alden, and she was talking about every time in history that we've added a new energy source to our grid, it is not necessarily pulled energy consumption away from the past technologies, coal, you know, coal power, etc., but it has just added a new sliver to that grid, or to that kind of whole pie chart. So my question is, in these times of need, when we know we're kind of on a fast track to global warming and we need to start changing some of those power consumption habits, how do we not only add these new, you know, forms of energy production into the existing mix, but reduce, you know, but help to push out some of that older stuff that's been, you know, so ingrained in our societies for so long?
No, I think that's a great question, Mike. And I think you're getting down to the subtleties of why the grid needs these balancing factors, because the only way to essentially ultimately reduce the amount of spinning reserves or more carbon, just say generally speaking, carbon-centric sources, is to bring dynamic ways to manage the grid. And it's to match intermittent supply with intermittent demand. If you don't do that, you may be able to run some of those carbon, more carbon-intensive solutions less often, but to bring more of them off of line, you need to create a market to incentivize people to shut off their usage at times. And the market is evolving, but it's playing a little bit of catch up relative to the advent of more renewable sources in the grid overall. And, you know, from our perspective, these are really, really exciting times, because not only have we seen this happen on the energy side, but really important on the technology and software side, we've also seen all of these advents with things like blockchain being a distributed network, with more and more applications using asynchronous communications. You know, it used to be when your computer ran out of batteries, you just lost all the work that you were working on. Now you plug it back in, you turn it back on, and Microsoft has saved all your work and you can pick up where you left off. All of those technologies and all of that capability that's been built in over the last decade plus are all things that are coalescing to allow for the tier 0 or non-mission critical. If, you know, things get shut off, the work can just pick right back up when the power comes back on. And so from our perspective, it's really exciting to be on both the sort of the cutting edge of both what's happening on the power side, but also marrying that with what's happened on both blockchain and just the computer and software advances over the last, you know, 10 plus years.
Yeah, it sounds like it's so much more of a kind of a two-tier problem where we have the hardware on one side and the software on the other side, but working so well to marry together to create these new solutions.
Absolutely.
Why don't we talk quickly about the solutions that Compute North is providing, and
Yeah.
mainly you guys being a co-location leader in co-location. Why don't you maybe explain a little bit about what co-location of mining is and how it provides benefit to the end, to the owner of that mining product?
Yeah. And so, at a very simple basis, we provide a turnkey solution for miners to own and operate their equipment. So, people buy a lot of equipment. A lot of our customers, to be fair, have probably never seen nor touched their equipment. It was drop shipped to our facility. We get it online for them. We manage that. We provide software that allows them to see the performance on a minute by minute basis. We provide a lot of insights to optimize that. Then the other thing we do is we help procure and manage. So we procure low cost power on behalf of our customers as part of our hosting services. But also through the advent of use of software and management, we also, as we've talked about at great length already, help manage that power cost through partnering with the grid to provide these demand response or intermittency of power when needed. And by doing that, we achieve low cost operations. And as everybody knows who's well ensconced in the mining business, that low cost of operations is the competitive advantage long term, and ensures, as we like to say, we're the Permian Basin, if you will, is to oil what Bitcoin needs for low cost operations. And as a result, we have we boast a lot of public companies who are mining who have looked to outsource part of their operations to professional operations like ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Now, you work with some of the biggest players in the space, but what is the minimum size that you would need in order to get involved with co-location with Compute North? Is it, can a mom and pop have a couple ASICs and send them over your way, or is there a minimum size client that you tend to work with?
Yeah, so generally speaking, I would say in the advent, we had a lot of ones and twos. Generally speaking, now, just given the sort of industrialization of the space, we've generally focused our off on those with 100 machines or more. Mm-hmm. Although we do work with a number of partners who help sort of aggregate and manage some of those smaller deployments. But generally speaking, we've targeted folks who are looking at more than 100 units of miners in a single deployment.
Got it. So moving back a little bit to earlier in our conversation when we were talking about Bitcoin and its almost path of least resistance to find the lowest cost energy. This conversation that we've had to rehash over and over and over again about the Bitcoin energy consumption debate. Why does Bitcoin consume so much energy? Why is that so much of a problem? I just like your kind of opinion on that debate, where that stems from, and how we can come together as a community and create a narrative that actually tells the average person, hey, Bitcoin is not boiling the oceans. It's actually providing a cleaner, better future for energy production.
Yeah, well, getting back to where we started, I mean, I don't think this is a black or white issue. I think it is a different shades of green. And I also think that as a space, that Bitcoin miners and the Bitcoin community cannot shy away from the fact that it essentially went from 0% of power usage at the day that it started to a little bit north of 0.5% of global power usage today. I also think that we have to acknowledge that proof of work applications do rely on that work to create the security that's necessary. And I think that, the space has looked at it, and obviously Bitcoin has been a proven distributed and security model. And as the value of the overall network increases, so should the security. If you've got over $1 trillion in assets earlier in the year, and hopefully growing to many times of that as the Bitcoin price rises and the number of things that rely on the value of Bitcoin rises, the security should increase.
Yeah.
And I think that, the distributed nature of the network is important. Now, with that said, I do think that as a community, we have to acknowledge the fact that with great power comes great responsibility, in the superhero mantra, so to speak, is that we do have to acknowledge that we have to be responsible citizens in the overall usage. And I think the way that we're doing that is by being willing to be the non-mission critical compute, being able to curtail when power may be more valuably used for hospitals or heating people's homes or things in times of need. But with that said, it also is providing that base demand, which is allowing for the build out and the growth of renewables. And so I think the answer of renewables good, carbon bad it's far too simplistic relative to where we're going. And so I think to your point, I think the narrative is that Bitcoin miners and Bitcoin applications and distributed applications can be non-mission critical and therefore are an important mix in the overall demand on the power network overall.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think even to take it farther back to a 10,000-foot view, what we were hitting on is that the true issue is the lack of understanding of the energy grid that we have today. And I think for people to, in the same way that you can't fully get into Bitcoin without understanding the monetary system that we're in today, you can't fully understand its energy needs until you fully understand the use of power on the grid today. So, such a complex problem. I love the way you've said it's, different shades of green, but all of these solutions are going to need to come together in order to create, a solution to that bigger problem. With respect to Compute North, what are some of the things, I know you say you're looking for the cleanest, lowest cost form of energy. What are some of the mechanisms that you're using to do that? Harvesting, renewables or flare gas, or can you maybe explain?
Yeah, so a lot of most of our facilities today are generally connected to the grid, and what we've done is we've partnered with the grid operators overall to create this ability to participate in the demand response markets. And so we continue to expand with some of our key power partners on that side to bring that service to bear to them. And we do that through a combination of software and network management to be able to bring mining servers offline in times that we get called upon. The other thing that we're doing more proactively now is a very simple example is that if I'm mining Bitcoin and I can make $250 a megawatt hour equivalent on power, and the real-time cost of power is north of that, it probably makes sense for me to shut off my servers. Right. Because essentially the incremental cost of producing that Bitcoin is actually costing me more than I'm actually earning. And so what we like to say is that through our approach to the market, we use dynamic power management and mining operations over time to continue to evolve to create the arbitrage opportunity between these. And the beauty of Bitcoin miners or miners in general is that they are in fact economic animals, if you will. That's why they're in the business. And by essentially allowing that dynamic management, which we increasingly believe is really part of the value add that we bring to our customers, is keeping their costs low, but also keeping their costs low by managing it on a essentially every 15-minute increment, is bringing that capability and that technology to the table to be able to find that balance between the ongoing monetary system, as you describe, and blockchain, and the power markets, and making sure that we're optimizing the relationship between those two. And in a sense, that really is the value add long term that Compute North is creating. And beyond the blockchain market, we will bring those capabilities to other compute functions as well, and the arbitrage between those. Because at the end of the day, if if it makes more sense to be doing 3D rendering for kids' movies, at a certain point in time, that might be the best use of that computing power.
Right, right. Well, Tad, this has been so enlightening, and thank you so much for your time today. If people want to get in contact with you or start working with Compute North on their mining facilities, how would they get in contact with you?
Yeah, the best way is actually to go to our website, where we've got the ability to chat with some of our folks in-house here, and that's at computenorth.com. And it's been a pleasure, Mike, to get to geek out with you a little bit today and talk about power and networks and all those kinds of things. So I appreciate you playing along with while we geeked out here. So
likewise, Tad, and all the best. Continue doing the great work that you're doing for our community.